We continue now at the top of Daf Chesam at Aleph Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 8a. And the previous Amud, the Gemara brought the Mishnah which said that Chatos is an exception to other Karbonos. And by Chatos, if you have Shinoi Kodesh or Shinoi Bailim, meaning to say you bring the carbon for a different carbon or you bring it for a different owner, so then it's completely puzzle, it's completely disqualified. And the Gemara now brings the sources for this. First, the Gemara in the previous Amud brought a source for Shchita, that you can't have Shinoi Kodesh. And now the Gemara continues, so we know Shchita. How do we know Kabbalah? How do we know the receiving of the blood? You can't have Shinoi Kodesh, it can't be for a different carbon. And the Gemara brings a pasuk, V'lokach ha-kohen midam ha-chatos. It says the Kohen takes from the blood of the chatos. From there we learn, Shetei Kabbalah l'shem chatos, that the receiving of the blood needs to be for the sake of a carbon chatos. V'yeshkechan shchita v'kabbalah. Now we find this by shchita, by slaughtering, and by kabbalah, by the receiving of the blood. Zrika minolan. From where do we know the zrika, the throwing of the blood, that you can't have shinoi kodesh? The Amar Kara, because the pasuk says v'chiper alav hakohen mechatoso. It talks about the kapara, shetehei kapara l'shem chatos, that the kapara, the atonement, should be l'shem chatos, and the atonement that refers to the zrika. And Rashi explains, V'lokach ha-kohen lashon Kabbalah, who the language of V'lokach refers to Kabbalah, the receiving of the blood. V'chiper hainu b'zrika, and the language of V'chiper, atonement, that's the zrika, that's the throwing of the blood. And Rashi notes, Holacha lo itzrich kro, we don't need a pasuk by Holacha, the bringing of the blood, the V'chlal Kabbalah hi misrabile, as we've said earlier in the Masechet, that's included within Kabbalah. And the Gemara continues, Eshkechan Shinoi Kodesh, so now we have sources by Shinoi Kodesh, Shinoi Bailim Minolan. So where do we find Shinoi Bailim? That if you have in mind for a different owner that it's problematic. Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Allah, it says for him, Allah v'lo al chaver, it has to be for him, and it cannot be for his friend, and that's the idea of Shinoi Bailim. And the Gemara continues, Eshkechan la mitzvah, so now we find sources for Shinoi Kodesh, Shinoi Bailim, that it's a mitzvah. In other words, it's lechatchila that you shouldn't have Shinoi Kodesh and Shinoi Bailim, but la'akev minol, and how do we know that it's ma'akev, that it completely disqualifies the carbon? And Rashi explains, Eshkechan la mitzvah v'ikash, if you're going to ask, mitzvah mehakesha de zos ha-Torah, mishlam amasi, the fact that it's a mitzvah, don't we already have a source from the pasuk of zos ha-Torah that we've mentioned previously that compares all the karbanos to one another, so they're all learned from shlamim kishar kol hazvachim, like all other karbanos. And Rashi says, inachinami, indeed that's actually true, that is a source, umaskana mehasam yalef lalakame, and in the end we will learn it from there, umeikara hu de mehadrinan de nichtavu kula begufe, but originally we look for sources within Chatos itself. And the Gemara continues and answers, the way we know la'akev is Kedo Amar Rav Huna Bereid Rav Yoshua, like Rav Huna the son of Rav Yoshua said, Chatos Chatos, so he said this in a different context, that it could have written Chatos and instead it says Chatoso. So Hachanam here also, Chatos Chatos, so we learn it out from the fact again that it could have said Chatos and it says Chatoso. Rashi explains, Kedamar Rav Huna l'kaman b'shmait, and Rav Huna is going to say this later in the sugya. Chataso, it says the word chataso, v'chiper olav hakoyin mechataso, midahavali l'michtav mechatas, from the fact that it could have said without a vav at the end. Ochsev vav yiseir, and it has the extra vav, l'midrash ba, l'shem bailim. So that's in order to make a drasha, that it has to be for the bailim, for the owners. And the Gemara continues and asks, Eshkechan mitzvah b'shinoi kodesh, so we find a mitzvah lechatchila by shinoi kodesh, uzrikan with regards to throwing the blood, b'shinoi bailim with regards to shinoi bailim, bein la mitzvah, bein li'akev. So then we see mitzvah and la'akev, because that last drush of chatoso, that's specifically by zrika, by shinoi bailim. And so therefore the question is, la'akev b'chol avodos, the fact that it's ma'akev by all avodos b'shinoi kodesh, by shinoi kodesh, uveshar avodos, and the other avodos besides zrika, b'shinoi bailim, by shinoi bailim, bein la mitzvah, bein la'akev, the fact that it's not only a mitzvah lechatchila, but also ma'akev minolon, from where do we know that? And Rashi explains, Eshkechan mitzvah b'shinoi kodesh, we find the mitzvah lechatchila by shinoi kodesh, b'chol avodos, by all avodos, uzrika eshkechan b'mitzvah v'ikov b'shinoi bailim, and by zrika we find not only mitzvah lechatchila, but it's also ma'akev by shinoi bailim, to ha-mechataso nami b'zrika ksiv shi ha-kapara, because mechataso is written by the zrika, which is kapara, which is atonement, and so therefore la'akev b'chol avodos b'shinoi kodesh, the fact that by shinoi kodesh, by all avodos it's ma'akev, shelo lamanu le'echon mehen, we didn't learn in any of them that it's ma'akev. Ushar avodos levad mizrika, and all the other avodos besides for zrika b'shinoi bailim, by shinoi bailim, bein lamitzvah, bein la'akev minolan. How do we know that it's both lamitzvah and it's la'akev? What's the source for that? And the Gemara continues and answers. Amar Rabbi Yonah. Rabbi Yonah says, Asya mechatas nazir. The source comes from the chatas of the nazir. Because it's written, V'hikriv hakohen lefnei Hashem, v'yoses chataso, v'yasolaso. It says the kohen offers before Hashem, and he brings the chatas and the ola. And we learn from there, Shayu kolas Yosef, that all of the doings have to be l'shem chatas. They have to be as a karban chatas, l'shem karban chatas. And Rashi explains, Sheyu kolas Yosef l'shem chatas, everything has to be l'shem chatas, u l'mitzvah lo itzrichra. And as we said, we don't need the pasuk to teach us l'chatchila, to hanafkol and mishar chatos. We already learned that out from other karban chatases, v'hai likuv, and so therefore this becomes a source for the fact that it is ma'akev. And the Gemara continues and asks, Eshkechon Shinoi Kodesh, so this source over here by Chatos Nazir, we find by Shinoi Kodesh, that's what it's talking about, L'Shem Chatos, Shinoi Bailim and all, and where do we know that the Shinoi Bailim is Mi'akev? And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Huna B'Reid Rav Yoshua, Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yoshua, says, Chatos Chatoso. That comes from the fact, again, that it could have said Chatos, and instead it says Chatoso, so that teaches us that Shinoi Bailim is Mi'akev. And Rashi explains, Amar Rav Huna says, Gabe Nazir Ksiv, by the Nazir it's written, V'yosas chataso v'yasolaso, it says his chatas and his ola, harei l'mitzvah, that's l'mitzvah. Ucheshlomim ma'ashlamim lo chilakto behen bein zriko l'shar avodos, b'shinoi bailim l'mitzvah. And then we say like Shlomim, just like by Shlomim, there's no difference between zrika and other avodos. By shinoi bailim, in terms of it being a mitzvah l'chatchila, af chatas, so too when it comes to a karban chatas, lo sechalik, bein zriko l'shar avodos la'akev, you don't make any distinction if the zrika is ma'akev, the other avodos are ma'akev, harei l'cha mitzvah v'ikov, so now you end up having mitzvah and the fact that it's ma'akev, bein b'shinoi kodesh, bein b'shinoi bailim, whether we're talking about shinoi kodesh or shinoi bailim, kach nirali, that's how it appears to me to explain this part of the Gemara, v'chein yesh l'foresh gavi chatos mitzora l'kamon nirali, and that's the same thing, the Gemara is going to bring chatos mitzora, same explanation. And the Gemara continues, maskif lo Ravina asks on this, ela me'ata, but according to that, if we're darshaning the vav in chataso, olas olaso my darashtabe, what are you going to darshan in the vav in olaso? And the Gemara says, Ravina, but according to Ravina, who's asking this question, what do we do with the vav at the end of olaso? Minchaso, what about the fact that it says minchaso with a vav at the end? Why doesn't he ask that question? And nesech nisko, it also says the word nisko. It says vinisko, the vav at the end. What do we do with that? My darashtabu, what's he going to do with that? Why is Ravina only bothered by the olaso, the vav at the end of olaso? And the Gemara continues and answers, Ahumi boile, when it comes to minchaso, when it comes to vinisko, that's needed for minchasam and Eskeim Balayla, that you can bring the mincha and the nesachim, the libations, at night. Minchasam and Eskeim Afilu Lamachar, you can bring the mincha and the nesachim even the next day. And so Ravina knows what to do with those vavs. Ela olas olaso my darashtu, but what are we going to do with the vav and olaso? Vesu, and further we have another question on learning from Chatos Nazir. Migamri mehadadi, can you learn one from the other? Can you learn a regular Chatos from Chatos Nazir? Chatos chaylev me Chatos Nazir lo gamri. You can't learn Chatos chaylev. Chatos chaylev just means a regular Chatos, the chatos of the forbidden fats. Can you really learn regular chatos from chatos nazir? You can't learn chatos from chatos nazir. Shekain yeshim adam macherim, because by chatos nazir there's other bloods, meaning to say there are other karbanos that the nazir has to bring. And chatos nazir me chatos chaylev lo gomer. You can't learn chatos nazir from regular chatos. Shekain kares, because that involves kares. And Rashi explains, Ula Ravina, now according to Ravina, who's asking on the vav at the end of olaso, the lo kashale ela olas olaso, he's only asking that it should have said olas and not olaso. He's asking, what do we do with that vav? Minchaso v'nisko, dechsivi nami gabe nazir. It says minchaso, it says v'nisko. Those are written by Nazir. Amai lo kashale. Why isn't that difficult to Ravina? And the Gemara answered, Ahumi boile, when it comes to minchasa, when it comes to nisko, that's necessary. Ki hechi d'darshinan l'chol minchasa v'niskeim, like we darshan by all of the cases of minchasa v'niskeim. We say balayla v'afilu l'machar. We say they can be brought at night. They can even be brought the next day. Sheyuchsharu lavo l'machar o balayla. They can be brought again tomorrow or tonight or in the night. Hachinami. So here also darshinan lahai v'asas minchaso. When it says by the nazir, you're going to do his mincha. As long as you do it, that's called his mincha, that's called his nesachim. Even though it wasn't brought together with the carbon. That's the idea of the pasuk. And so the real question that he had again was by olaso. And the Gemara then said, Migamri also, can we really learn Shar Chatos, V'chatos Nazir, Mehadadi, can you learn other Chatoses from Chatos Nazir? The Tim Salomar Chad L'mitzvah, V'chad L'akev, that then you can say one of them is to tell you Mitzvah L'chatchila, the other one's to say it's Ma'akev. Rashi notes, Stam Chatos Kari Chatos Chelav. In general, Chatos is referred to as Chatos Chelav, Mishum D'Shchicha Tvei, because that's the common kind of Chatos. Shekain Kares, and the Gemara mentioned that when it comes to Chatos Chelav, that's a situation of Kares. Mechaperes al Chayve Kares, that's an atonement for liability to Kares. Alma lo gamri mehadadi, you see that they are not learned from one another. V'kevan de lo gamri mehadadi, and if they're not learned from one another, tarvayu lemitzvah tzrichu, so then really both times they're needed just to tell you mitzvah lechatchila, each on its own. By regular chatos, we now have a source for mitzvah lechatchila. By chatos nazir, we have a source for mitzvah lechatchila, but you can't say that it's a source for la'akev. And so the Gemara continues and answers, Elam Rava, rather Rava says, Asya mechatos mitzora. We actually learn the idea that it's la'akev from chatos mitzora, the chatos that a mitzora brings, that a leper brings, d'chsiv, as it's written, V'yosa kohen es hachatos, the kohen does the chatos, shu kol asiyosav l'shem chatos, that everything that's done has to be l'shem chatos, and ve'eshkechon shinoi kodesh, so we find this by shinoi kodesh, shinoi bailim inole. Where do we find shinoi bailim? Amar Kra, the pasuk says, "V'chipar al hamitayr." It says that it will be an atonement for the one who is pure. Al hamitayr zeh, meaning on this person who's being pure, who's being made pure. V'lo al hamitayr chaveru, and not on his friend. And that's the idea of shinoi bailim. And so therefore, again, we learn from chatas mitzora to regular chatas. And this also, Rashi already explained that this kind of limud is the same kind of limud by chatas nazir, as Rashi explained earlier. But the Gemara still asks, "Vakati," but still, mi yalfa mehadadi. Can you really learn one kind of chatas from the other? Chatas chelav me chatas mitzora lo yalfa. You can't learn chatas chelav from chatas mitzora. Shekein yeshim adam macherim, because there's other bloods, there's other karbanos that the mitzora brings. And chatas mitzora me chatas chelav lo gamra. You can't learn chatas mitzora from chatas chelav. Shekein kares, because that involves kares. So that's not a good source. The Gemara says, well, maybe we can say mechada lo asi. You can't learn from one of them, but teisi chad me tarti. But maybe you can learn one from two of them, meaning you have a combination of two of them that can teach to the other. And the Gemara says, well, behelo lichtov. Well, in which one should we not write about this idea of shinoi kodesh, shinoi bailam, that we're going to learn that out from the other two? Lo lichtov rachmana b'chatas chelev. If you're going to say the Torah shouldn't write it by chatas chelev, v'teisei mehanach, and it will be learned from the others, from chatas nazir and chatas mitzora. Malahanach sheken yeshi mohem dam macherem. Those two are unique because there are other bloods, there's other karbanos that are brought, and so you can't learn from them. Lo lichtov rachmana v'chatas nazir. Let the Torah not write it by chatas nazir. V'teisei mehanach. It'll be learned out from a combination of chatas chelev and chatas mitzora. Malahanach sheken ein lohen she'el. Over there, there's no concept of she'ela. Nazir is like a neder, it's like an oath that can be undone when you ask the chacham to undo the neder. That doesn't apply by the other chatases. And lo lichtov rachmana b'chatas mitzora. Maybe you'll say, let the Torah not write it by chatas mitzora, v'teisei mehanach, and that can be learned from the other two, from chatas chelev and chatas nazir. Malahanach, but what's unique about chatas chelev and chatas nazir, shekein ein boin bedalus. There's no concept of bringing a different carbon when the person has less money, when he's poor, and so therefore you can't learn it out. And so the Gemara says, Elam Arkra, rather the pasuk says, the source that Rashi mentioned above, Zos HaTorah la'ola v'lamincha v'gomer. Again, the Torah compares all of the different karbanos. Hikishu ha'kosav l'shlamim. The Torah compares them all to shlamim. Ma shlamim ben shinoi kodesh ben shinoi bailim ba'inon l'shmon l'mitzvah. Just like by shlamim, whether we're talking about shinoi kodesh, whether we're talking about shinoi bailim, it needs to be l'shma as a mitzvah l'chatchila. Avchatas ben shinoi kodesh ben shinoi bailim ba'inon l'shmon l'mitzvah. So too when it comes to chatas, whether we're talking about shinoi kodesh or shinoi bailim, it needs to be l'shmon as a mitzvah l'chatchila. Hilkach mitzvah mishlamim. Therefore, the mitzvah lechatchila, the source comes from shlamim. V'hanach kroy, and then the psukim we brought above la'akev. That comes to teach us that it's not just a mitzvah lechatchila, but it is ma'akev. And the Gemara continues, ve'eshkechon chatas chelav d'chsiv ba lechatas. Now we find this by the case of chatas chelav where it says lechatas, and Rashi explains, eshkechon chatas chelav d'chsiv ba lechatas v'shachar osol lechatas b'stam chatas ksiv. When it says v'shachar osol lechatas, that's written by regular chatas. Im nefesh kisecheta, it says im nefesh kisecheta. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ches Amud Beis.